Imagine a world where your entire future, your very worth, was decided by a bundle of cloth, a few coins, or a patch of land. A world where the moment you were born, your family began a lifelong financial tightrope walk, all for the sake of your marriage. A world where, if things went wrong, you could lose everything, and nobody would bat an eye. Does that sound like a nightmare? Welcome to 730, at a time when such harsh realities were the norm for countless women. But how exactly did these ancient dowry practices trap women in cycles of injustice? And what did that really look like across different corners of a distant world? Number 7. The burden of dowry in the Byzantine Empire. Step into the bustling streets of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, in 730. Imagine the grandeur, the mosaics, the echoes of Roman power still vibrating through its every stone. But beneath this glittering surface, for the women of this mighty empire, a deeply ingrained system called the proix, or dowry, shaped their entire lives from infancy. This was not merely a gift, it was a societal imperative, a financial obligation that dictated a woman's social standing, her potential marriage prospects, and even her future security. For a woman to marry, she absolutely had to bring a dowry. It was the entry fee into married life, and without it, her options were bleak, often forcing her into convents or a life of dependence. Proix was typically provided by the bride's family, a collection of property, land, money, jewelry, household goods, that was formally transferred to the husband upon marriage. On the surface, this might seem like a beneficial arrangement for the woman, as the dowry was theoretically meant to provide for her and her children, particularly in widowhood. However, the reality was often far more complex and riddled with injustices. First, the very act of accumulating a dowry placed an immense financial strain on families, particularly those with multiple daughters. A father might spend years, even decades, saving and preparing these assets, diverting resources that could have been used for other children's education, family investments, or simply improving their living standards. Daughters were, in a very real sense, a financial burden before they were even old enough to walk. Consider the social pressure. A family with a small dowry, or worse, no dowry at all, faced immense difficulty arranging a marriage for their daughter. This meant that poor families often had to make impossible choices, sometimes selling off ancestral lands or incurring significant debt, just to make their daughters marriable. A woman's worth was intrinsically linked to the size and quality of her dowry. A large dowry could secure a marriage into a higher social class, elevating her status. But a small one could condemn her to a less desirable match or no match at all, often leading to social ostracization and a life of profound disadvantage. The system effectively created a market where women were valued commodities, their price determined by the wealth their families could assemble. Once the dowry was transferred, its management and control often fell squarely into the husband's hands. While Byzantine law stipulated that the dowry was technically for the wife's maintenance and not the husband's personal property to squander, in practice, a husband had significant control over its use and investment. He could manage the lands, collect the rents, or invest the money, often without direct consultation with his wife. This created a profound power imbalance. A wife might see her dowry assets diminished through her husband's poor management, reckless investments, or even outright deceit, with little recourse. Imagine a woman, having brought a significant amount of land or a large sum of gold to her marriage, watching helplessly as her husband misused or lost it, knowing that these assets were meant to be her lifeline if he were to die or divorce her. Her future security was tied to his financial acumen and integrity, rather than her own. Furthermore, the dowry became a central point of contention in cases of marital breakdown. If a marriage ended in divorce, particularly one initiated by the husband, the return of the dowry could be a contentious and lengthy legal battle. While laws theoretically protected the woman's right to her dowry, proving fault, navigating the complex legal system, and reclaiming assets from a powerful husband could be incredibly difficult, often leaving women impoverished and vulnerable. A husband might refuse to return the full amount, claiming losses or debts, or simply dragging out the legal process until the woman was too desperate or exhausted to continue. In a society where women had limited economic independence outside of marriage, losing her dowry meant losing her only potential source of livelihood, forcing her back into dependency on her family or leaving her destitute. This system, while seemingly offering protection, often served to reinforce male authority and economic control over women, making their financial security entirely dependent on their husband's goodwill and the vagaries of legal enforcement in a patriarchal society. The Byzantine dowry system, for all its legal complexities, frequently functioned as a financial trap, binding women to their husband's economic fate and limiting their autonomy in ways that are hard to comprehend today. Number 6. The precarious promises of the dower in the Frankish kingdoms. Travel west from Byzantium, across the Mediterranean, to the rugged forested lands of the Frankish kingdoms in 730 AD. Here, the Carolingian era was just beginning to stir, and a different form of marital wealth transfer, the Morgengabe, or mourning gift, played a crucial role in women's lives, often alongside a system known as dowry, often functioned more like a bride price, or property transferred by the groom or his family. The Morgengabe was a gift given by the husband to his wife on the morning after their wedding night, symbolizing the consummation of the marriage, and often intended as a form of security for her in widowhood. This practice sounds romantic, a gesture of love and commitment, but its practical application was often fraught with injustice and left women in a deeply vulnerable position. Unlike the Byzantine dowry, which came from the bride's family, the Morgengabe originated with the groom. It typically consisted of land, livestock, precious objects, or a sum of money. The intention was to provide the wife with a degree of economic independence, particularly if her husband died. However, the amount and nature of the Morgengabe were entirely at the husband's discretion or that of his family. This meant that a woman's future security was entirely dependent on the generosity, or indeed the stinginess, of her husband and his kin. There was no standardized amount, no legal minimum, and often no guarantee that the gift would be sufficient to sustain her if tragedy struck. A woman might marry into a wealthy family only to receive a paltry Morgengabe, leaving her vulnerable to poverty upon her husband's death, despite her initial high hopes. Furthermore, the legal status and control over the Morgengabe were often ambiguous and subject to the prevailing customs of different regions and the power dynamics within individual families. While the gift was nominally hers, she often did not have full, independent control over it during her husband's lifetime. It was frequently managed by him or remained part of the larger family estate, meaning she could not sell it, trade it, or even make independent decisions about its use. Her right to it often only fully materialized upon widowhood. This put her in a precarious limbo. She knew she was entitled to something, but could not actively use it to improve her life or plan for her future until her husband was gone. This arrangement tied her hands economically during her marriage, reinforcing her dependence on her husband's management and financial decisions. The real injustice became starkly apparent upon the death of the husband. While the Morgengabe was intended to provide for the widow, its actual delivery and enforcement were far from guaranteed. Widows often faced intense pressure from their husband's family, particularly his brothers or adult sons, who might attempt to reclaim the Morgengabe for the family estate, especially if it involved valuable land. They might argue about its size, its rightful ownership, or simply refuse to hand it over. Imagine a newly widowed woman grieving, suddenly finding herself embroiled in a bitter dispute with her in-laws, fighting for the very means of her survival. She might have little legal recourse, especially if she lacked powerful male relatives to advocate on her behalf. The ability to enforce her claim often depended on her social connections, her family's influence, and the goodwill of the local lord. Without these, a widow could easily be dispossessed, left with nothing but the clothes on her back and the children to feed. This was particularly devastating for women who had no other means of support, having spent their married lives dependent on their husbands. They had no independent wealth, no trade skills, and often no family to return to if they had married from afar. The mourning gift, ostensibly a protective measure, often became a battleground, transforming a woman's promised security into a legal and social struggle she was ill-equipped to win. Precariousness of this gift, its reliance on male discretion, and the whims of a patriarchal inheritance system, meant that for many Frankish women, their future remained uncertain, their security a fragile promise that could shatter with a single death. Number 5. The Mund and Morgengifu conundrum in Anglo-Saxon England. Cross the churning waters of the English Channel and land on the green shores of Anglo-Saxon England in 730 AD. Here, society was structured around king groups and local lords, and marital practices were characterized by two key elements, the Mund and the Morgengifu. The Mund was essentially a payment made by the groom to the bride's family, a form of bride price or protection payment, signifying the transfer of her guardianship from her father or male guardian to her husband. The Morgengifu, much like its Frankish counterpart, was a mourning gift given by the husband to the wife after the wedding. While these practices might appear to offer some form of security or compensation for the woman or her family, they often entrenched deeply unjust power dynamics that limited women's autonomy and economic independence. The Mund payment itself, while going to the bride's family, effectively commodified the woman. It signified a transaction, a transfer of legal authority over her. She was not consulted on the amount, nor did she receive any direct benefit from it. Her father or guardian would receive the payment, often using it to strengthen family ties, acquire resources, or even just as a general family fund. The woman herself was simply the object of the transaction. This meant that her personal consent, her desires, or her future security were secondary to the male-led economic arrangements between families. Imagine a young Anglo-Saxon woman observing her future being negotiated, her worth being calculated in cattle or silver, knowing that the price for her would go directly to her father rather than securing her own future. She was, in essence, an asset being exchanged rather than an individual entering into a partnership. The Morgengifu, the mourning gift, was indeed meant to be the wife's personal property, intended to provide her with an independent income or assets, especially important in widowhood. It could include land, money, or valuable possessions. However, the amount was entirely at the husband's discretion. There was no legal framework mandating a minimum or a proportion of his wealth. This meant that a wealthy man might give a generous Morgengifu, ensuring his wife's comfort, while a poorer man, or simply a less generous one, might give a meager offering that would barely sustain her. This created a stark inequality, where a woman's future security was entirely dependent on the whim and wealth of her husband, rather than on a standardized legal right. Furthermore, during the marriage, a woman's control over her Morgengifu was often limited. While it was technically hers, societal norms and the practicalities of managing property meant that her husband would typically manage it or incorporate it into the larger family estate. She might not have the right to sell or alienate the property without his consent, or the consent of his kin. This economic dependency during marriage meant that even with a Morgengifu, she remained tethered to her husband's economic decisions and managerial skills. If he mismanaged the assets, or if the property declined in value, her future security was directly undermined, with little she could do to intervene. The most profound injustice arose, as in other cultures, upon the husband's death. While the Morgengifu was intended to be her lifeline as a widow, the reality was often a harsh struggle for its possession. Her husband's male relatives, particularly his sons, especially if they were from a previous marriage, or brothers, might challenge her claim to the Morgengifu, arguing over its extent or even its legitimacy. In a society where property rights were often fluid and disputes settled through negotiation, kinship, ties, and often brute force, a widow was incredibly vulnerable. She might lack the powerful kin to support her claim, leaving her susceptible to pressure, intimidation, and ultimately dispossession. The Anglo-Saxon laws, though developing, often provided limited direct protection for women in such disputes, leaving them to rely on the goodwill of their in-laws or the intervention of a local lord. Many widows would have found themselves stripped of their promised security, forced back into dependency on their birth families, or left with nothing, a testament to the precarious nature of a system that nominally provided for women, but often failed them in practice. Number 4. The Mahr's unfulfilled promise in the Umayyad Caliphate. Now let us journey to the vast and rapidly expanding lands of the Umayyad Caliphate in 730 AD, stretching from Spain to India. Here, Islamic law was beginning to solidify, and a key component of marriage was the mahr, often translated as dower. Unlike the dowry systems where the bride's family provided wealth, the mahr was an obligatory payment made by the groom to the bride herself. It was considered her exclusive property to be used as she saw fit, and was intended to provide her with financial security and a degree of independence. On paper, the mahr seems like a progressive concept for its time, granting women direct ownership over wealth. However, the practical application of the mahr was often plagued by subtle and profound injustices, leaving many women economically vulnerable, despite the legal framework. The mahr was typically divided into two parts: a prompt payment given at the time of marriage, and a deferred payment due upon divorce or the husband's death. While the prompt payment often provided the bride with some immediate resources, it was frequently the deferred payment that presented the most significant challenges and injustices. The amount of the deferred mahr could vary widely, depending on the family's wealth, social status, and the prevailing customs. However, there was often an unspoken understanding, or even explicit agreement, that the deferred mahr might never actually be paid, or would only be paid in extreme circumstances. This meant that a woman's primary financial security was often the theoretical promise, a figure on a marriage contract that might never materialize during her lifetime. One of the most common injustices arose when a marriage ended in divorce. While the mahr was legally due to the woman upon divorce initiated by the husband, wives often faced immense pressure to waive their right to the deferred mahr in exchange for an amicable separation, or simply to avoid prolonged disputes, hence social ostracization. In a society where a woman's social standing was heavily tied to her husband and family, challenging his refusal to pay the mahr could be a daunting prospect. She might fear social repercussions, difficulty in remarrying, or simply the immense financial and emotional toll of engaging in legal battles against a more powerful husband and his family. Imagine a woman having devoted years to her marriage, suddenly faced with a divorce, knowing that her promised financial security hangs in the balance, and that demanding it might come at an even greater personal cost. Furthermore, even if the husband was willing to pay, he might do so in installments, or offer assets that were difficult to liquidate or of diminished value. The lack of immediate, tangible control over the deferred mahr meant that women lived with a constant underlying insecurity. Their financial future was a promise, but a fragile one, dependent on their husband's continued life, his financial solvency, and his willingness to uphold his contractual obligations. If he died, his heirs might dispute the mahr amount or delay its payment, forcing the widow into a legal quagmire. Another insidious injustice lay in the potential for the mahr to be set at an unrealistically high amount. While this might seem beneficial on the surface, making divorce less appealing for the husband, it could also mean that the prompt payment was small and the deferred payment was so large as to be effectively uncollectible, becoming a mere formality rather than a genuine security. This inflated mahr then served more as a deterrent to divorce for the husband rather than a true guarantee of the woman's financial independence. It created an illusion of security without the practical reality. The mahr, for all its legal protections, often functioned as a tool for male control and economic manipulation, tied women into marriages with the promise of future security that was frequently contingent on male goodwill, leaving them vulnerable to economic hardship, social pressure, and the unfulfilled promise of their own legal rights in a patriarchal society. Number 3. The dowry's double-edged sword in Tang Dynasty China. Journey eastward to the magnificent Tang Dynasty in China around 730, a period of immense cultural flourishing and sophisticated administration. Marriage practices here were deeply rooted in Confucian social order, emphasizing family lineage, hierarchy, and propriety. The concept of dowry or jia suang was central to marriage negotiations. Unlike the European models, the zhaizhuang was often seen as the bride's contribution to her new household, a transfer of wealth from her birth family to her marital family, intended to signify her new status and contribute to her new home. While it might seem like a straightforward transfer of assets, the dowry system in Tang China was rife with injustices that profoundly affected women's lives, trapping them in economic and social binds. Firstly, the expectation of providing a dowry placed immense financial pressure on the bride's family. A family with daughters was expected to provide a dowry that reflected their social standing and enhanced the daughter's desirability as a bride. This could involve valuable goods, such as silk, jewelry, furniture, household utensils, and even servants. Competition to provide a substantial dowry was intense, leading families to go into significant debt, deplete their savings, or even sell off assets just to secure a good marriage for their daughters. This meant that the birth of a daughter, while a blessing, could also be a source of economic anxiety as her future dowry loomed large. Imagine a family, year after year, scrimping and saving, denying themselves comforts, all to assemble a dowry that would make their daughter worthy in the eyes of her future in-laws. This systemic pressure forced families to prioritize a daughter's marriage over other investments, sometimes leading to the impoverishment of the entire household. Furthermore, once the dowry was transferred, its effective control often shifted to the husband's family, particularly the mother-in-law. While the dowry was theoretically the wife's property, designed to support her in her new home, in practice she often had little direct control over its management or use. The mother-in-law, as the head of the household women, would often oversee the dowry goods, integrating them into the family's shared resources. This meant that a woman's dowry, intended to be her security and contribution, effectively became absorbed into her husband's family wealth, with her having limited say in its application. Her personal assets became community property within her new family, diminishing her individual economic autonomy. She might arrive with valuable silks and jewels only to see them used by her mother-in-law, given to other family members, or gradually used up without her direct consent. The most profound injustice arose in the event of marital discord or divorce. While a woman was theoretically entitled to reclaim her dowry upon divorce, particularly if she was sent away by her husband, the reality was often far more complex and disadvantageous. The process of divorce was often initiated by the husband, and the ability to reclaim the dowry often depended on proving fault or navigating complex legal and social norms. Her husband's family might dispute the amount, claim losses, or simply refuse to return it, leaving her with little recourse. Without her dowry, a divorced woman was in an incredibly vulnerable position. She would often have to return to her birth family, who might view her as a burden, having already invested heavily in her dowry. She would likely face social stigma, making remarriage difficult, and without her dowry she had no means of independent support. Moreover, the dowry system often encouraged families to view daughters as temporary members of the household, destined to leave and take family resources with them. This contributed to a cultural preference for sons, who would remain in the family and contribute to its wealth without taking a dowry out. While this preference had deeper roots, the economic burden of the dowry certainly exacerbated it, creating a pervasive bias against female children. For Tang dynasty women, the dowry, while a customary and necessary part of marriage, often functioned as a financial straitjacket, binding them to their husbands' families, limiting their autonomy, and leaving them deeply vulnerable in times of distress, their economic security a mere phantom. Number 2. The evolving demands of Stridon in ancient Indian kingdoms. Let us journey to the diverse and ancient lands of the Indian subcontinent in 730. Here, numerous kingdoms and cultural traditions coexisted, but overarching legal and social principles, often codified in texts like the Dharmashastras, influenced marriage practices. One significant concept was Stridon, which translates roughly to woman's property. Stridon theoretically comprised gifts given to a woman at the time of her marriage by her parents, husband, or other relatives, intended to be her exclusive property that she had full control over. On the surface, this sounds remarkably progressive, granting women unparalleled economic independence. However, the realities of its implementation, combined with evolving social pressures and the patriarchal structures of the time, often turned this intended protection into a source of significant injustice. While Stridon was legally recognized as a woman's separate property, its actual control and management during her marriage were often subject to the whims of her husband and in-laws. In many households, particularly those of joint families, the wife's Stridon assets, whether in the form of jewelry, garments, or even land, were often managed by the husband or the senior women of the family. The wife might not have direct immediate control over these assets, being unable to sell them, mortgage them, or make independent decisions about their use without the consent or knowledge of her husband or his family. This meant that while she legally owned the property, her practical agency over it was severely curtailed, tying her economic decisions to her husband's authority. Imagine a woman with valuable gold ornaments given as Stridon, only to see them kept in the family safe by her mother-in-law, only brought out for special occasions, and certainly not something she could use for her own purposes without permission. A more insidious injustice arose from the societal pressure to provide substantial Stridon, which, over time, began to function less as a voluntary gift and more as an expectation or even a demand. While the concept of dowry in its later, more oppressive forms, demanding payments from the bride's family to the groom's family, was not yet fully solidified in 730. As a universally problematic system, the gifting aspect of Stridon created a competitive environment. Families of brides felt compelled to offer generous Stridon to secure a good match for their daughters, reflecting their social standing and wealth. This subtly shifted Stridon from a protective measure for the bride into a means of pouting the bride's family's wealth, thereby influencing the groom's family's decision. This placed immense financial strain on families with daughters who might incur debt or deplete resources to assemble an impressive collection of gifts. The true injustice became even more apparent in the event of marital strife or widowhood. While Stridon was meant to be the woman's absolute property, providing security in times of need, in practice, its recovery or preservation was often challenging. In cases of separation or abandonment, or even upon the husband's death, a woman might face immense pressure from her husband's family to relinquish her Stridon, especially if it consisted of valuable assets like land or significant amounts of gold. They might claim it was rightfully theirs or simply refuse to return it, leaving the woman with little legal recourse, especially if she lacked powerful male relatives to advocate on her behalf. Furthermore, the legal texts, while recognizing Stridon, sometimes allowed for exceptions or interpretations that limited its absolute nature, especially in times of family distress or when the husband needed to use it for pious purposes. These exceptions could be exploited, effectively allowing husbands to appropriate their wives' stridon under various pretexts, leaving women financially vulnerable. The very promise of stridon, her independent property, often proved to be a fragile protection, easily circumvented by societal pressures, family power dynamics, and the often lax enforcement of women's property rights in a deeply patriarchal society. For women in ancient Indian kingdoms, stridon was a concept that offered a glimmer of autonomy, but was often overshadowed by the practical injustices that prevented them from truly wielding their own economic power. Number 1. The Lombard law's unjust control over women's property. Finally, let's turn to the Lombard Kingdom of Italy in 730 AD. This Germanic kingdom, ruling much of the Italian peninsula, operated under a distinct legal code known as the Edictus Rothari, which laid down strict rules regarding marriage, property, and women's rights. Here, a woman's financial standing and her control over her own property were intricately linked to her marital status and her male guardians. While the Lombard laws recognized certain forms of property for women, the overarching principle of male guardianship, or mundium, created a system where women had little to no independent economic agency, rendering any property they possessed subject to severe limitations and ultimately injustice. Under Lombard law, every free woman was always under the mundium of a male guardian, her father, her brother, or upon marriage, her husband. This mundium was not merely a symbolic guardianship, it was a legal right of control over her person and her property. A woman could not enter into contracts, buy or sell property, or initiate legal proceedings without the consent of her munjwald, guardian. This meant that even if a woman inherited land or received gifts, she could not freely manage or dispose of these assets. Her economic life was entirely dictated by her male guardian, effectively stripping her of financial autonomy. Imagine a woman inheriting a valuable piece of land from her deceased mother, only to realize she could not rent it out, sell it, or even use its produce for her own independent purposes without her husband's explicit permission, turning her inherited wealth into a controlled asset rather than a source of freedom. Concept of a dowry, in the sense of wealth brought by the bride's family, was not as central in Lombard law as the faderfio, father's gift, and the morgencap, mourning gift similar to Frankish practices, which were gifts given by the husband to the wife. However, the injustice here lay not just in the size or nature of these gifts, but in the overarching control exercised through mundium. Even these gifts, once given, fell under the husband's mundium. He could manage them, profit from them, and even dispose of them, provided he acted in a way that purportedly protected the wife's interests. In practice, this often meant he could use her property for his own ends, with little recourse for the wife if she disagreed or felt exploited. Her legal ownership was overshadowed by his practical control. The most severe injustice manifested in cases of divorce or widowhood. While the morgencap was intended to provide for the widow, its enforcement was challenging. If a marriage ended in divorce, particularly one initiated by the husband, a woman's ability to reclaim any property, including her morgencap, was tenuous and dependent on the consent of her male guardian. Even if she was entitled to certain assets, she could not initiate legal proceedings herself. She needed her munjwald to act on her behalf, and if he was unwilling or unable, she was effectively powerless. This legal dependency meant that a woman's economic security was not truly her own, but rather a reflection of the strength and willingness of her male relatives to fight for her rights. Furthermore, upon the death of her husband, a widow would typically pass from the mundium of her deceased husband to another male guardian, often her son, brother, or nearest male relative. She never truly escaped male control over her property. While her morgencap was meant to support her, her sons or her deceased husband's family might still exert significant influence or even control over its management, particularly if it was land. This continuous male guardianship meant that even if a woman was nominally wealthy, her wealth was always filtered through the decisions and authority of a man. She never had true economic independence or the unfettered ability to manage her own financial destiny. The Lombard legal system, with its provisus mundium, fundamentally denied women their economic agency, turning their inherited or gifted property into assets managed by men, leaving them in a perpetual state of financial dependence and limited autonomy, a stark reminder of the deep-seated injustices that shaped women's lives in 730 AD.